Hey everybody, it's the Commodore from the Clan of the Grey Wolf, and you are watching the weekly Wringer series here on clanofthegreywolf.com. Very glad to say this week I am back within a week, the way that it should be, the way that God intended the weekly Wringer to play, which, you know, I'm very happy to say that time and space has aligned in such a way that, that I can accomplish such a feat, which is fantastic. So, in any case, I'm back and ready to talk. On another note, normally at this particular point of the show, I say something like, wow, we have lots to talk about. This week, not so much. We'll reflect on that. I don't say that to mean that this is going to be a bad show or a short show or any of that kind of stuff, because it won't be. We'll definitely find things to always fill our time here. And there's plenty to kind of talk about in terms of how this conversation spreads out. But in any case, let's just say that this week it's not nearly as much to talk about as I think we've experienced in past weeks here on the Weekly Wringer. Part of that is due to the fact that I asked you a question last week that I think I assumed would inspire a lot of diverse answers, and let's just put it this way: I assumed incorrectly. I'll reflect on that and you know, try to patch things up for a question I thought would really split the community, but ended up not doing so. And then I will, you know, give you my own thoughts and kind of spread the conversation out a little bit more to where I think some of the branches might really exist for some future questions and some good implications for those things. And then I'll ask a question for next week, which I think for all of you that are nostalgic or have some kind of remembrance of your early internet days, I think you're very much going to like this question. So that will be the question for next week. All right. So, as I do with every show, I like to kick things off by welcoming our new folks, which I think is very important because, as you know, the comments keep the show going. So, this week we have Yoshi the Retro Gamer. Welcome to you. Both an incredible, you know, reference to retro gaming and the idea of being a retro gamer that, you know, enjoys, I guess, playing with Yoshi or perhaps is of Japanese origin or whatever the case might be. I like that. Yoshi the Retro Gamer, welcome to you. And then Muscular Thumbs, which I thought was a very, very creative name. I don't know how muscular my thumbs really are when it gets down to it. I mean, I've used them for a lot of gaming over the years, but I don't know. Do you really develop your thumb muscles that much doing it? But anyway, glad to have you, even if you are not the most of muscular, you are not of great muscular stature in the thumb department. Great to have you on board as well. Thank you for commenting here on the Weekly Wringer. Welcome, and I hope to hear much from both of you moving forward with the Weekly Wringer. All right, here we go. We have got to tackle the question for last week that I assumed in classic election fashion would split the community, and we could really have a good discussion about both sides and so on and so forth. Needless to say, I was a little disappointed in that. Not disappointed in you guys necessarily, although there is a little bit of that, but more, you know, disappointed that maybe the question wasn't the right way, or that I picked the wrong franchises or what have you, or I said it the wrong way, or what the case might be. So I point the, as with many things with the Weekly Wringer, I point the finger squarely at myself. And so, the question I asked you guys last week was a classic comparison question, and it went something like this: soundtracks, Halo, Final Fantasy. And I think there were, you know, a couple of, as I am one to do now, I will go through a list of the kind of pervading thoughts that work throughout the entire argument over the course of all the comments. First is that I think many of you were saying this was an unfair comparison. I disagree with that to a certain extent. I think it is a fair comparison. I think that many of you lack the expertise, which makes it, you know, perhaps a biased one. Yes, I'll give you that. But I don't think it's necessarily unfair, although I think if it depends on how you define great music and how you define a great soundtrack. And so I think the way that many of you are thinking about what defines a great soundtrack or what defines great music, then yeah, you're probably right. It is an unfair comparison. That's number one. Number two is, you know, I was actually very, very surprised at this. And I don't know why, guys. I don't know why. But I was shocked at how many of you, or how much of our viewership here, so how many of you that watch me every week, so on and so forth, have not played Halo, or have not played a significant amount of Halo, or haven't played every iteration of Halo. I think I was not surprised to see that almost all of you had a tremendous amount of experience with Final Fantasy. Even if you hadn't played every single iteration, you played, a fair amount of some of them and have a good idea what the music is composed and looks like. But I was shocked that most of you have exactly zero experience with the music of Halo and the breadth of music that Halo provides. And I was disappointed by that. I don't know why I expected it. I just expected all of us to have played it, and I guess that was a really poor assumption on my part. But I have to say I'm very surprised by that. One of the most popular gaming franchises in history, and many of you have played it for 15 minutes or less. In fact, most of you have probably played it for 15 minutes or less, according to the comments. And so at that point, it really becomes kind of a crapshoot because, as you all know, the comments skewed heavily toward Final Fantasy. In fact, I think it was a landslide, as a matter of fact, because I don't think there was at all a single vote for Halo. Although there were some good breakdowns and analyses of Halo, which I appreciated for those of you that wanted to be a little bit more open-minded and not just bash a game series that you know nothing about. So let me move to number 3, which is that Final Fantasy has a lot of nostalgia tied to it, and the nostalgia of Final Fantasy really adds to a lot of the enjoyment of the soundtrack. 100% agree there. Halo, as much as I think it's become one of the most popular parts of gaming in terms of a franchise, it is relatively young. I mean, it is 10 years old, versus Final Fantasy, which has been around since the late 80s, right? So our concept of those, comparison for most of us out there that have been in gaming for 20 years now, or played video games for the better part of 20 years or even longer, we have a certain nostalgic connection with Final Fantasy, which gives it a certain element of benefit that we don't provide for franchises that are a little bit younger and don't have the history. So in that regard, some of you out there that might say, well, that's an unfair comparison. I get that. You're dealing with a franchise with 20 plus years under its belt versus a franchise with 10 plus years under its belt, and I totally get that. So I understand. Anyway, those were some of the things I saw that were kind of floating through the arguments. Let me jump into what some of your comments were that I thought were worthy of mention, and then I'll get into a little bit more of what I think about why this was a valid question to ask and kind of how we move forward. The Bowtie guy said neither, first of all, which I appreciated. It wasn't just that, hey, this is a route for Final Fantasy or what have you. The Bowtie guy takes a fairly neutral stance to say, well, really neither. I'm going to work out here and say that this is not a comparison I'm ready to make. And the reason why is because that Halo tends to be more of a cinematic kind of backdrop, because Halo, in and of itself, at least in the as compared to the early iterations of Final Fantasy, is intended to be very cinematic in nature. Halo is kind of a direct descendant of the Half-Life mentality, which is that the game, when you pick it up and you start playing it, is supposed to evolve over time as kind of a cinematic, it is kind of a narrative, but at the same time, really, it's just kind of these series of events that you play through that are epic and large, and one thing leads to another, and the dominoes fall down, and eventually you find a way to make it to the end, and it becomes one cohesive story of everything that you've done. Halo is strongly in that camp, and therefore, for those of us that are sitting here thinking, well, because some of you were sitting there saying, well, what about the music of Half-Life? And you'd be right. There is music in Half-Life, but it's fairly limited, and it's not really. There's not really a lot of. It's not a point of emphasis. That being said, Halo makes it a tremendous point of emphasis. It's one of the most important aspects of the game, and I believe one of the best aspects of making the single-player campaigns as successful as they are. If you play Halo without the background music, you are really losing a tremendous amount of the experience. And I think those of us that have spent a significant amount of time in many of the different Halo games know exactly what I'm talking about. And those of you that play multiplayer, right? And a lot of the multiplayer, at least on the early iterations of Halo, had nothing to do with music whatsoever. This is basically just a, you know, run and gun kind of an experience, and there's not really anything going on with that. You know, I'm always amazed at now, you know, when I play certain other kinds of games that are MMOs or whatever, you know, PvP kinds of games, even FPSs, how music really does play very strongly in there, because if you don't have music, it becomes this kind of desolate, awful experience of just kind of looking around and shooting things that move. All right, so the Bowtie Guy says that Halo is very cinematic, whereas Final Fantasy is much more thematic, and it's kind of classical in nature. And Uematsu is striving in many ways to, you know, mimic the masters, as many of you pointed out. You know, not just the kind of masters of video game classical score production, which is very difficult to do, you know, when you begin life, you know, on an NES game, right? It's very difficult to make that kind of transition. But at the same time, you know, Uematsu is also working to try to mirror some of his favorites, the great classical composers, and he's trying to, although he's not himself the the Mozart of video game composition, I think there are many other people that you could consider for that title. You know, Uematsu is very, very good at writing themes that are very reminiscent of the aspirations and feelings of characters in Final Fantasy games. And what that does is it really makes those themes and those moments really resonate very well beyond the gaming experience. I'm going to get into a little bit more of this in a little while, but that is very, very important to remember. And I couldn't agree more. I think the Bowtie Guy has got it. Halo's cinematic. It's, you know, it's kind of the backdrop. It's there. It's a fully immersive part of it. Don't get me wrong, but you know, Final Fantasy is more thematic. It's themes. It's, you know, you want, as soon as somebody comes on, you know, exits and enters the stage, you want the music to go away and come back, because that's something that reminds you of that character and their experience and the story and the narrative and all those kinds of things. So, and I couldn't agree more about that. DTX 180 talked about Final Fantasy really having a lot more diversity, and so that would be the reason why DTX 180 would nominate Final Fantasy as the winner. You know, and I already said that there's a lot more. There are many more games and a lot more material to go through for Final Fantasy than there is for Halo. No question about it, right? But I think in many ways there's more diversity because of the thematic nature of Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy, you know, really centers around many different characters, almost too many to think about. And each of those characters then, you know, really in the world of Uematsu has their own theme, has their own, and some of them have several, right? Or as Mr. K said, quite rightly, that they have more like their own leitmotif that then develops into a lot of different kinds of compositions, which I agree with 100%. But, you know, there is more diversity in Final Fantasy, and that gives it a certain, different kind of feel. You know, Halo is always about this kind of futuristic sci-fi world in which the hero, in impossible fashion, emerges to do the impossible, right? To achieve what we would otherwise think was unachievable, right? So the music is heroic and epic, and it's very urban, it's very industrial. It's very militaristic in many ways. And so that leaves a little bit to be desired in terms of what the capabilities and possibilities are for Halo. And I think that's a good point. Pyros talked about that really, and this echoes the Bowtie Guy, but I think it's important distinction, is that the music serves different purposes. So the music in Halo is a functional element of the story. As you move, you know, I mean, forget battle music from Final Fantasy for a second, and just think about how the music really gets played out as a soundtrack, right? The music is thematic. It's very memorable. It helps you remember certain moments. Halo is very cinematic. It's designed to keep the action moving, to make you feel like you're in the midst of it all. one of the